let's talk about planning. The planning season has opened. So whether you're planning in your corporate environment for your project, organization, department, or for your next business year, or whether you're planning for your personal life, this video is for you. I've got two major planning approaches, either forward planning or backward planning, and I'll walk you through when to use which. Hi, I'm Angelika. I'm a leadership coach helping you be the leader you know you can be. I've also been a project manager for 15 years of my life, leading large-scale projects like IT implementations across the globe and change initiatives and the like. So I have extensive experience with planning. There's two major approaches to planning that we're going to tackle in today's video. One is backward planning and one is forward planning. Let's start with backward planning because that seems to be the most prevalent when we're looking at what's being taught. Let's use the example of planning for an event. When you're doing backward planning, you're setting the date in the future. Say we want to host an event in April, and then you plan backwards to today, starting at the end, at the goal, saying, okay, on this and that date in April, that's our event. What needs to be in place? That is the major question. What needs to be in place in order to make this event a success? All right, we need a venue, we need invites, we need people to actually attend our event. We possibly need music or we need tech, depending on the type of event that we're having, etc. You get the idea. So what needs to be in place? And in order to have those in place, what needs to happen before? Say we need to book a venue. If we're thinking large-scale trade fairs, this year's October may already be super late to book a venue for next year, April. If we're looking at a local restaurant for a company party, we may have some more time. So based on our idea of this is the final date, this is the deadline, what needs to be in place, what do we need to do, and when do we need to start doing that? What's the duration of creating something or developing something? Or what is a timeline, like an advanced timeline that we need to consider for some external entity like the venue? That provides us our backward planning. And you could go back from this needs to be in place, and oh, hang on a second, in order to have this in place, we need to prepare something else even before that. And that brings you in total to where you need to start or when you need to start. And in some cases, you may even realize, dang, I should have started yesterday, like we often had when we started planning for our exam preparation, for example. That is also a classic example for backward planning. You know, this is the date of the exam. And then you look at, what are all the things that I need to do between then and now? What do I know? If I need that time for revision, that means I need to know everything. I need to have gone through all my stuff before I start revising. That is backward planning. In forward planning, same idea of we're hosting an event in April. We would start, we know that's the date for the event. We're starting here. Like, okay, what is the first thing we need to do? And what then? What is the next step? What else do we need to do? So the question is moving forward. And our planning would also be considered like, okay, this is where we start. And then this is the first stage. And then we do the next stage. And we may actually have the same conclusion that we need to book that venue for the trade fair as quickly as possible. Or we may actually start thinking about, who do we want to invite and how do we communicate to them? What campaigns do we need if we're looking at a public event? That kind of thing. And what has to happen next? The main difference is in where you start for your planning and also in the type of questions you're asking. As you just saw, if we're starting with forward planning, it's like, okay, what's next? What do we need to do in this first stage? So when do you use backward planning and when do you use forward planning? Let's start with backward planning. Backward planning works best when you know exactly the timing of your event in our example, or if you have a very clear deadline, say an outer constraint, a client expectation, a year-end closing, an exam date, or something like a regulation that says you have to hand in paperwork by X date. It could also be your own intention of setting a certain deadline. I don't know, say you want to launch a product, or you want to make sure that your team is proficient in a certain software by X date. Then you may actually set that date like, okay, by the end of this year, by the start of the next month, my team shall be proficient in this and that skill. So it doesn't have to be an outer constraint that sets the timing. It can also be your own decision to say, this is the deadline that we're working against. The key is the timing or the date is really important. It may even be more important than the quality or the extent of detailed polishing that you do for your design. It may be more important to how much automation is already built into that first solution or the solution that is being delivered. I've done a lot of IT projects, so a lot of the time when the timing is really fixed and we need to deliver the functionality to the client, we may actually detract some of the scope when we see that we're falling behind on the timing, because we may not be able to do all the polished screens, we may not be able to do all the automations, but we can deliver the functionality. So you would reduce the scope, and you might reduce the polishing to a certain extent. Obviously, the thing that you want to deliver or create needs to have a certain quality, otherwise it is not the final product. You can take away some of the extras, some of the, it would really be nice in my ideal world, this should also be in there. You can reduce that in order to hold the deadline. So that is when you do backward planning, when the timing is really, really essential. Also, when you have a lot of dependencies and constraints and you have a really narrow path, you have to consider a lot of things. It is best to work backwards, because you may come to conclusions as you go backwards. You may see that you have a dependency to other departments, to providers, to vendors. You may see that you have a certain number of milestones where you have a much tighter timeline in order to make sure that you can actually keep that dependency. And that's when I advise backward planning. In order to do backward planning with a certain amount of quality and substance, you need to have some idea of what you're about to do. So you need to have some idea of the scope, like what does this entail, that project, that product launch, that whatever that you're doing, and or you need to know something about your process, like how to do this. If you have no idea how to do that, you're better off doing forward planning. We'll get to that in a moment. Because if you go backward, you need to have some idea of what those steps might be. The final one is, if you know that you love a deadline, if you're motivated by a deadline, then by all means, go and set a deadline, either for yourself or in working for your team. It helps with prioritization, it helps with time management, and there's this old adage that says we always fill the time that is available. So if we don't have some kind of time box, and we're getting to that in a moment, if we don't have any kind of limitation or constraint, we tend to allow ourselves to fill the time. Forward planning. When do you do forward planning? First of all, when the quality, the result, the final product is more important than the exact timing. So in contrast to backward planning, where timing is essential because you have a year-end closing or a certain trade fair to hit with your product launch, when we have no exact date that we need to hit, but we want to make sure that we give a certain quality of a result, say a client requirement, or a client expectation. That is when we're going for forward planning. Forward planning is also great if you don't exactly know what you need to do, because you're still figuring this out as you go. That is typical in research projects or in exploratory development of either a new product, in an innovation, or a new software, or a new tool, or a new design. So if you don't know what exactly will be the content or the moving parts, forward planning is great. Or if you don't know what your process looks like, say it's your first time creating such a design for your client, or it's the first time you're writing a book and you've never done it before. You're not quite sure how long something will take or what are the steps involved in doing the editing, say. So whenever you're not quite sure like what your project would look like, then forward planning is the way to go. Also, forward planning is great if you have few or loose constraints. Like you have a bit of leeway, and the more leeway you have, the better off forward planning will work. The moment you start to have tight constraints, you're better off with backward planning. Also, forward planning is great if you love freedom and choice. If you feel personally super boxed in and demotivated with a tight deadline and more constraints and even more timelines and deadlines and milestones in between, you're better off with forward planning. Because remember, with forward planning, you start right here and then you look at what's next. What's next in line? What is the next step? What do I do next? And then at that stage, you can go into the next phase. So forward planning is great if you have an expansive field, if you can explore, and if you're not quite sure what your project or your year entails. When you do forward planning, do make sure that you watch your budget, and that budget refers also to your energy and your effort, because a never-ending or an open-ended project is a bit dangerous when you work with clients, because there's a high risk of frustration, because it never ends. It may always be in an extra iteration, which can be frustrating for both you if you're producing and delivering that, and for the client who never gets a finished thing. It can also take your personal energy into burnout, because you're aiming for even more, or you realize as you go, oh my goodness, this is so much bigger than I thought. Oh my goodness, how can I do that? And then in order to achieve your goal, you put in an extra phase and an extra step. So watch out for what is your budget in terms of energy or money. If we're looking at client projects in the corporate world, if we're producing a product or developing a software, obviously there's no unlimited budgets there, right? So you need to make sure, if you're extending for yet another stage, how much leeway do you still have? Does that at some stage get into some kind of limitation or an end of goodwill, either with a client or an end of goodwill with your feeling good about putting in yet more effort? That's the risk with, that's one of the dangers with forward planning. Some advice when you go with forward planning: embrace some of the agile principles of iterations and cycles. Embrace some of the review mentality, like when you have one step finished, then do a review, gather your learnings, and then take those learnings into the next iteration. Also work to some extent with time boxes. Time boxing means limiting your time. You may know this from meetings, saying, okay, we're doing a Azure fix and each participant has 5 minutes or 2 minutes for their status updates. Those 2 minutes that you provide them, that's a time box. And similarly, you can give, for your exploratory forward planning project, you can give yourself a time box saying, okay, what is the thing that I do next month? Okay, this is the next iteration. Or what is the next step? Okay, I'm giving myself so and so much, or I'm giving the team 2 weeks, and then we're reviewing this again. Because otherwise, if you leave everything open-ended, we tend to use the time available. If you've ever studied for some kind of exam, you probably remember that if there's an exam timeline, then we can cram in a lot into our brains within 3 hours. We can even do all-nighters and create a paper within a day and a night. But we could also extend that timeline for 3 months, because probably we knew about that exam or handing in that paper 3 months ago. So these are some of the tips that I have for forward planning. Watch out for your energy or your budget, and also make use of iterations, reviews, and time boxing. And for backward planning, be prepared to actually reduce some of the extra scope or the nice to have scope when your timeline approaches, when you see that things are getting narrow, that you get delayed, that you get behind. Check for the essentials. What is the minimum requirement? What still delivers the product? What is the minimum viable functionality that you can deliver? Or what is the process that you can actually implement and still feel that, yeah, this is my timeline accomplished and my result achieved. Be prepared to negotiate by reducing some of the scope or by putting in extra effort. That would be your personal time, more people on your team, and potentially spend more money in order to hit that timeline. What's your preferred planning approach? Let me know in the comments if you prefer the backward planning or the forward planning. What's your thing? See you next time. Have a good time.